There are 80 million people today who had a stroke. But what happens after stroke? Suddenly, a number of highly specialized neurons are deprived from their metabolic substrate and they cease to work. Actually, just 2 minutes after the stroke, structural damage is already visible. And as a consequence, we can observe a number of disabilities or impairments that occur at different domains. We can observe, for instance, that patients present problems in communication, in speech, also in the understanding of language. We can also see motor impairments, which can affect the upper extremities or the lower extremities. So now I would like to show you a video of a patient that presents hemiparesis. So as you can see, this individual is trying to open a jar, and the left arm and hand is affected. This person is not showing enough strength, but also is not able to extend the fingers or to control the movement of the more proximal segments of his arm. So we observe a little bit of spasticity, which is related to this lack of ability for extending the fingers at the distal level.
You gotta turn it the other way.
So this is challenging the life, the quality of life of the patient and the independence of the patient, right?
Right.
So
That's the
how can
challenge.
we overcome these impairments? First, we need to understand the patient's journey. So just after the stroke, the patient is hospitalized and presents a number of impairments, as I said before. For instance, can be related also to chronic pain or to loss of cognitive functioning, or even to the emotional domain. And after this first stage of hospitalization, at the very acute stage, the patient starts receiving treatment or rehabilitation. This usually starts occurring at a subacute stage after the first weeks after the lesion. And what we observe is that after several weeks of training, the patient shows a significant improvement in motor in the motor impairment, right? So what we can see from data sets, collecting longitudinal data from different patients with hemiparesis, is that this recovery seems to follow a pattern. It seems to be proportional to the initial impairment of the patient. This means that those patients that are more severely affected after the injury seem to recover more, according to the Fugl-Meyer scale, which is a standardized measure of impairment in hemiparesis. We also observe another pattern in the recovery, and this pattern shows that those patients that start therapy earlier seem to recover more than those patients that start therapy later. So for this reason, we can say that the recovery is structured. Patients at the late chronic stages have low responsiveness to treatment. After a long outpatient phase, in which the patients or the outpatients may follow a therapy schedule that consists on visiting the hospital 2 or 3 times a week and receiving occupational therapy or other types of therapies. After this period, the patients are discharged at different periods. It is adjusted to each individual, but also it differs across countries. And at this point, the patient returns home, but in many cases, still impairments are present. What we observe is that there is a huge deterioration happening just after the hospital discharge. Actually, some literature has reported that 4 years post-hospital discharge, there is 80% loss in motor function. This has been linked to the term rehabilitation in vain, since it means that a big investment, time, and also economic investment is lost due to this deterioration. Also, this deterioration links to the probability of reoccurrence of a second stroke or deterioration that links to rehospitalization. So it's important that we understand which are the factors that are influencing the deterioration, but also those factors that are influencing the patient's responsiveness to the therapy, so we can augment them. So to do that, we need to understand which are the principles of motor learning. And the good news is that our brains are able to reorganize and to recover function. This is a study that was conducted by Nudo and colleagues in 92, in which they show how if you expose monkeys to a very specific motor training program, in which these monkeys need to perform repetitively a pinch movement, distal movement, then you can measure the reorganization of cortical areas in primary motor cortex. So what they observe is that in order to induce reorganization, in order to repair the primary motor cortex, the subject needs to be exposed to therapy that is highly repetitive, which is also called massed practice, and that is also very specific. So it's targeting specifically those movements that are challenging. And these are the two main principles that support improvement and recovery of or relearning of motor skills. But this is not enough, because if we want to optimize rehabilitation, we need to also provide therapies that are grounded on motor learning principles that promote not only improvement but also the retention of those skills that are relearned. And for this, literature shows us that the practice needs to be structured in time, which means that it needs to introduce resting periods. It needs to be intense enough, challenging enough, patient-tailored, and it has to be reinforced, both through feedback, explicit feedback, but also through implicit feedback and augmented sensory feedback. Finally, if we want to have a complete rehabilitation or optimal rehabilitation protocol, then we need to take into account the third pillar of rehabilitation, which is generalization. We need to maximize the generalization of improvements so they have impact in the patient's lives. So it's not enough with training patients to grasp very specific object during training, but we want to see how these improvements translate into grasping objects during the execution of activities of daily living. And for this, we identify additional principles of motor learning, such as task variability. We need to provide training that is variable. And we need to introduce also, or to provide training that is embodied, in which patients can train while using and experiencing their own body parts. But this is not enough, because we see here 7 principles of motor learning. Probably there are many more we could discuss, such as goal-oriented training and others. But what we have to take into account is that there are certain principles that do not refer to motor learning and that interact closely with them. And these are the principles of recovery. We need to distinguish them. And this is a very nice experiment conducted by Saylor and colleagues, which can serve as an example of those motor recovery mechanisms. In here, the authors expose mice to a specific training task. And in this task, the mice need to perform a distal movement to grasp an object. And what they do is they introduce a stroke after training when the mice reach certain level of performance. And now they do not allow mice to move. For 8 consecutive days, they are not exposed to any training. After that, they introduce the training and they observe partial recovery of the motor function that was lost. Now they introduce a second stroke in an adjacent area in premotor cortex, or the analogous to the mice. And here they introduce a second stroke which causes immediately a loss in function. But now they only wait 2 days for introducing again the training, the rehabilitation. And this early introduction of training leads to a complete recovery. So this is a great example which points out two main ideas behind the mechanisms of motor recovery. First, it seems that training very early after stroke is critical. And second, it shows how behavior drives recovery. It shows how closely the principles of motor learning interact with those principles of motor recovery and that seem to be unique to the injured brain. Actually, these mechanisms of recovery have been associated to a critical window of recovery in which the patient shows higher plasticity and higher potential or responsiveness to the treatment. So does this mean that after the critical window is closed and this enhanced plasticity is not present anymore, there's nothing we can do? Well, we know that that's not the case because we observe that in the case of chronic patients, we can still induce through therapy, through behavior, we can induce recovery. This is an experiment on humans, chronic stroke patients, in which the authors are reporting not only functional improvements as captured by the MAL scale, a standardized assessment of function, but also they correlate these improvements at the behavioral level with changes in reorganization, markers of reorganization, such as a shift in the centroid of cortical maps in primary motor cortex. So reorganization is still possible at the chronic stage, and it leads to functional recovery. But in order to induce recovery at the acute, at the subacute, and at the chronic stage, it's important that we always take into account the principles of motor learning. And we build therapies that ground on those principles and that also take into account the principles of motor recovery.